For the read part of tonight's video, I accidentally lost the video files. So I'll put up a thumbnail instead, and you guys can enjoy a strictly audio version of tonight's read. Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our interim series on Ludwig von Mises's The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality with Chapter 4, The Non-Economic Objections to Capitalism. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, the reason we are doing this series is two parts. One, because it's a bit too short to be doing a proper series on, and two, of course, as I've mentioned, to get your input. So let me know in the comments section what it is you'd like for me to read next in this series, and I'll be happy to oblige. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, we'll be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to the analysis and review part of the video so you can jump straight to that if that's how you'd like to go about things. Also, in this chapter, Ludwig von Mises breaks up what is by far the longest read in this book into several parts. I'll let you know when we get to each section in this video, and I'll also put timestamps in this video's description to those sections so you guys can better keep track of things in case you need to take a break. Speaking of which, this is also by far the longest read in this series, in this book anyways. So I may have to break this read up into several parts and then stitch them back together in editing, so bear with me. And with all that said and out of the way, let's begin tonight's read, which is Chapter 4, The Non-Economic Objections to Capitalism. Part 1, The Argument of Happiness. Critics level two charges against capitalism. First, they say that the possessor of a motor car, a television set, and a refrigerator does not make a man happy. Shit. Let me start this over. Part 1. The Argument of Happiness. Critics level two charges against capitalism. First, they say that the possession of a motor car, a television set, and a refrigerator does not make a man happy. Secondly, they add that there are still people who own none of these gadgets. Both propositions are correct, but they do not cast blame upon the capitalistic system of social cooperation. People do not toil and trouble in order to attain perfect happiness, but in order to remove as much as possible some felt uneasiness and thus to become happier than they were before. A man who buys a television set thereby gives evidence to the effect that he thinks that the possession of this contrivance will increase his well-being and make him more content than he was without it. If it were otherwise, he would not have bought it. The task of the doctor is not to make the patient happy, but to remove his pain and to put him in better shape for the pursuit of the main concern of every living being, the fight against all factors pernicious to his life and ease. It may be true that there are among Buddhist mendicants living on alms and dirt and penury, some who feel perfectly happy and do not envy any nabob. However, it is a fact that for the immense majority of people, such a life would appear unbearable. To them, the impulse towards ceaselessly aiming at the improvement of the external conditions of existence is inwrought. Who would presume to set an Asiatic beggar as an example to the average American? One of the most remarkable achievements of capitalism is the drop in infant mortality. Who wants to deny that this phenomenon has at least removed one of the causes of many people's unhappiness? No less absurd is the second reproach thrown upon capitalism, namely, that technological and therapeutical innovations do not benefit all people. Changes in human conditions are brought about by the pioneering of the most clever and most energetic men. They take the lead, and the rest of mankind follows them little by little. The innovation is first a luxury of only a few people, until by degrees it comes into the reach of the many. It is not a sensible objection to the use of shoes or of forks that they spread only slowly, and that even today millions do without them. The dainty ladies and gentlemen who first began to use soap were the harbingers of the big-scale production of soap for the common man. If those who have today the means to buy a television set were to abstain from the purchase because some people cannot afford it, they would not further but hinder the popularization of this contrivance. Part 2. Materialism. Again, there are grumblers who blame capitalism for what they call its mean materialism. They cannot help admitting that capitalism has the tendency to improve the material conditions of mankind. But, they say, it has diverted men from the higher and nobler pursuits. It feeds the bodies, but it starves the souls and the minds. It has brought about a decay of the arts. Gone are the days of the great poets, painters, sculptors, and architects. Our age produces merely trash. The judgment about the merits of a work of art is entirely subjective. Some people praise what others disdain. There is no yardstick to measure the aesthetic worth of a poem or of a building. Those who are delighted by the Cathedral of Chartres and the Meninas of Velázquez may think that those who remain unaffected by these marvels are boors. Many students are bored to death when the school forces them to read Hamlet. Only people who are endowed with a spark of the artistic mentality are fit to appreciate and to enjoy the work of an artist. Among those who make pretense to the appellation of educated men, there is much hypocrisy. They put on an air of connoisseurship and feign enthusiasm for the art of the past, an artist passed away long ago. They show no similar sympathy for the contemporary artist who still fights for recognition. Dissembled adoration for the old masters is with them a means to disparage and ridicule the new ones who deviate from traditional canons and create their own. John Ruskin will be remembered, together with Carlyle, the Webbs, Bernard Shaw, and some others, as one of the gravediggers of British freedom, civilization, and prosperity. A wretched character in his private, no less than in his public life, he glorified war and bloodshed, and fanatically slandered the teachings of political economy which he did not understand. He was a bigoted detractor of the market economy, and a romantic eulogist of the guild. He paid homage to the arts of earlier centuries, but when he faced the work of a great living artist, Whistler, he dispraised it in such foul and objurgatory language that he was sued for libel and found guilty by the jury. It was the writings of Ruskin that popularized the prejudice that capitalism, apart from being a bad economic system, has substituted ugliness for beauty, pettiness for grandeur, trash for art. As people widely disagree in the appreciation of artistic achievements, it is not possible to explode the talk about the artistic inferiority of the age of capitalism in the same apodictic way in which one may refute errors in logical reasoning or in the establishment of facts of experience. Yet no sane man would be insolent enough as to belittle the grandeur of the artistic exploits of the age of capitalism. The preeminent art of this age of quote-unquote mean materialism and money-making was music. Wagner and Verdi, Berlioz and Bizet, Brahms and Bruckner, Hugo Wolf and Mahler, Puccini and Richard Strauss. What an illustrious cavalcade! What an era in which such masters as Schumann and Donizetti were overshadowed by still superior genius. Then there were the great novels of Balzac, Flaubert, Maupassant, Jens Jacobsen, Proust, and the poems of Victor Hugo, Walt Whitman, Rilke, Yeats. How poor our lives would be if we had to miss the work of these giants and of many other no less sublime authors. Let us not forget the French painters and sculptors who taught us new ways of looking at the world and enjoying light and color. Nobody ever contested that this age has encouraged all branches of scientific activities. But, say the grumblers, this was mainly the work of specialists, while quote-unquote synthesis was lacking. One can hardly misconstrue in a more absurd way the teachings of modern mathematics, physics, and biology. And what about the books of philosophers like Croce, Bergson, Husserl, and Whitehead? Each epoch has its own character in its artistic exploits. Imitation of masterworks of the past is not art, it is routine. What gives value to a work is those features in which it differs from other works. This is what is called the style of a period. In one respect, the eulogists of the past seem to be justified. The last generations did not bequeath to the future such monuments as the pyramids, the Greek temples, the Gothic cathedrals, and the churches and palaces of the Renaissance and the Baroque. In the last 100 years, many churches and even cathedrals were built, and many more government palaces, schools, and libraries. But they do not show any original conception. They reflect old styles, or hybridize divers old styles. Only in apartment houses, office buildings, and private homes have we seen something develop that may be qualified as an architectural style of our age. Although it would be mere pedantry not to appreciate the peculiar grandeur of such sites as the New York skyline, it can be admitted that modern architecture has not attained the distinction of that of past centuries. The reasons are various. As far as religious buildings are concerned, the accentuated conservatism of their churches shuns any innovation. With the passing of dynasties and aristocracies, the impulse to construct new palaces disappeared. The wealth of entrepreneurs and capitalists is, whatever the anti-capitalistic demagogues may fable, so much inferior to that of kings and princes that they cannot indulge in such luxurious construction. No one is today rich enough to plan such palaces as that of Versailles or the Escorial. The orders for the construction of government buildings do no longer emanate from despots who are free, in defiance of public opinion, to choose a master whom they themselves held in esteem and to sponsor a project that scandalized the dull majority. Committees and councils are not likely to adopt the ideas of bold pioneers. They prefer to range themselves on the safe side. There has never been an era in which the many were prepared to do justice to contemporary art. Reverence to the great authors and artists has always been limited to small groups. What characterizes capitalism is not the bad taste of the crowds, but the fact that these crowds, made prosperous by capitalism, became quote-unquote consumers of literature, of course, of trashy literature. The book market is flooded by a downpour of trivial fiction for the semi-barbarians. But this does not prevent great authors from creating imperishable works. The critics shed tears on the alleged decay of the industrial arts. They contrast, e.g., old furniture as preserved in the castles of European aristocratic families and in the collections of the museums with the cheap things turned out by big-scale production. They fail to see that these collectors' items were made exclusively for the well-to-do. The carved chests and the intarsia tables could not be found in the miserable huts of the poorer strata. Those caviling about the inexpensive furniture of the American wage earner should cross the Rio Grande del Norte and inspect the abodes of the Mexican peons, which are devoid of any furniture. When modern industry began to provide the masses with the paraphernalia of a better life, their main concern was to produce as cheaply as possible, without any regard to aesthetic values. Later, when the progress of capitalism had raised the masses' standard of living, they turned step by step to the fabrication of things which do not lack refinement and beauty. Only romantic prepossessions can induce an observer to ignore the fact that more and more citizens of the capitalistic countries live in an environment which cannot be simply dismissed as ugly. Part 3. Injustice. The most passionate detractors of capitalism are those who reject it on account of its alleged injustice. It is a gratuitous pastime to depict what ought to be and is not, because it is contrary to inflexible laws of the real universe. Such reveries may be considered as innocuous as long as they remain daydreams. But when their authors begin to ignore the difference between fantasy and reality, they become the most serious obstacle to human endeavors to improve the external conditions of life and well-being. The worst of all these delusions is the idea that, quote-unquote, nature has bestowed upon every man certain rights. According to this doctrine, nature is open-handed toward every child born. There is plenty of everything for everybody. Consequently, everyone has a fair and inalienable claim against all his fellow men and against society that he should get the full portion which nature has allotted to him. The eternal laws of natural and divine justice require that nobody should appropriate to himself what by rights belongs to other people. The poor are needy only because unjust people have deprived them of their birthright. It is the task of the Church and the secular authorities to prevent such spoliation and to make all people prosperous. Every word of this doctrine is false. Nature is not bountiful, but stingy. It has restricted the supply of all things indispensable for the preservation of human life. It has populated the world with animals and plants to whom the impulse to destroy human life and welfare is inwrought. It displays powers and elements whose operation is damaging to human life and to human endeavors to preserve it. Man's survival and well-being are an achievement of the skill with which he has utilized the main instrument with which nature has equipped him, reason. Men, cooperating under the system of the division of labor, have created all the wealth which the daydreamers consider as a free gift of nature. With regard to the quote-unquote distribution of this wealth, it is nonsensical to refer to an allegedly divine or natural principle of justice. What matters is not the allocation of portions out of a fund presented to man by nature. The problem is rather to further those social institutions which enable people to continue and to enlarge the production of all those things which they need. The World Council of Churches, an ecumenical organization of Protestant churches, declared in 1948, quote, "Justice demands that the inhabitants of Asia and Africa, for instance, should have the benefits of more machine production." End quote. This makes sense only if one implies that the Lord presented mankind with a definite quantity of machines and expected that these contrivances will be distributed equally among the various nations. Yet the capitalistic countries were bad enough to take possession of much more of this stock than, quote-unquote, justice would have assigned to them, and thus to deprive the inhabitants of Asia and Africa of their fair portion. What a shame! The truth is that the accumulation of capital and its investment in machines, the source of the comparatively greater wealth of the Western peoples, are due exclusively to laissez-faire capitalism, which the same document of the churches passionately misrepresents and rejects on moral grounds. It is not the fault of the capitalists that the Asiatics and Africans did not adopt those ideologies and policies which would have made the evolution of autochthonous capitalism possible. Neither is it the fault of the capitalists that the policies of these nations thwarted the attempts of foreign investors to give them, quote, the benefits of more machine production, end quote. No one contests that what makes hundreds of millions in Asia and Africa destitute is that they cling to primitive methods of production and miss the benefits which the employment of better tools and up-to-date technological designs could bestow upon them. But there is only one means to relieve their distress, namely, the full adoption of laissez-faire capitalism. What they need is private enterprise and the accumulation of new capital, capitalists, and entrepreneurs. It is nonsensical to blame capitalism and the capitalistic nations of the West for the plight the backward peoples have brought upon themselves. The remedy indicated is not quote-unquote justice, but the substitution of sound, i.e. laissez-faire, policies for unsound policies. It was not vain disquisitions about a vague concept of justice that raised the standard of living of the common man in the capitalistic countries to its present height, but the activities of men dubbed as quote-unquote rugged individualists and quote-unquote exploiters. The poverty of the backward nations is due to the fact that their policies of expropriation, discriminatory taxation, and foreign exchange control prevent the investment of foreign capital, while their domestic policies preclude the accumulation of indigenous capital. All those rejecting capitalism on moral grounds as an unfair system are deluded by their failure to comprehend what capital is, how it comes into existence, and how it is maintained, and what the benefits are which are derived from its employment in production processes. The only source of the generation of additional capital goods is saving. If all the goods produced are consumed, no new capital comes into being. But if consumption lags behind production, and the surplus of goods newly produced over goods consumed is utilized in further production processes, these processes are henceforth carried out by the aid of more capital goods. All the capital goods are intermediary goods, stages on the road that leads from the first employment of the original factors of production, i.e. natural resources and human labor, to the final turning out of goods ready for consumption. They all are perishable. They are, sooner or later, worn out in the process of production. If all the products that are consumed without replacement of the capital goods which have been used up in their production, capital is consumed. If this happens, further production will be aided only by a smaller amount of capital goods, and will therefore render a smaller output per unit of the natural resources and labor employed. To prevent this sort of dissaving and disinvestment, one must dedicate a part of the productive effort to capital maintenance, to the replacement of the capital goods absorbed in the production of usable goods. Capital is not a free gift of God or of nature. It is the outcome of a provident restriction of consumption on the part of man. It is created and increased by saving and maintained by the abstention from dissaving. Neither have capital or capital goods in themselves the power to raise the productivity of natural resources and of human labor. Only if the fruits of saving are wisely employed or invested do they increase the output per unit of input of natural resources and of labor. If this is not the case, they are dissipated or wasted. The accumulation of new capital, the maintenance of previously accumulated capital, and the utilization of capital for raising the productivity of human effort are the fruits of purposive human action. They are the outcome of the conduct of thrifty people who save and abstain from dissaving vis-a-vis the capitalists who earn interest, and of people who succeed in utilizing the capital available for the best possible satisfaction of the needs of the consumers vis-a-vis the entrepreneurs who earn profit. Neither capital or capital goods, nor the conduct of the capitalists and the entrepreneurs in dealing with capital could improve the standard of living for the rest of the people if these non-capitalists and non-entrepreneurs did not react in a certain way. If the wage earners were to behave in the way which the spurious quote-unquote iron law of wages describes, and would know of no use for their earnings other than to feed and to procreate more offspring, the increase in capital accumulated would not keep pace with the increase in population figures. All the benefits derived from the accumulation of additional capital would be absorbed by multiplying the number of people. However, men do not respond to an improvement in the external conditions of their lives in the way in which rodents and germs do. They know also of other satisfactions than feeding and proliferation. Consequently, in the countries of capitalistic civilization, the increase of capital accumulated outruns the increase in population figures. To the extent that this happens, the marginal productivity of labor is increased as against the marginal productivity of the material factors of production. There emerges a tendency toward higher wage rates. The proportion of the total output of production that goes to the wage earners is enhanced as against that which goes as interest to the capitalists and as rent to the landowners. To speak of the productivity of labor makes sense only if one refers to the marginal productivity of labor, i.e., to the deduction in net output to be caused by the elimination of one worker. Then it refers to a definite economic quantity, to a determinate amount of goods or its equivalent in money. The concept of a general productivity of labor, as resorted to in popular talk about an allegedly natural right of the workers to claim the total increase in productivity, is empty and indefinable. It is based on the illusion that it is possible to determine the shares that each of the various complementary factors of production has physically contributed to the turning out of the production. If one cuts a sheet of paper with scissors, it is impossible to ascertain quotas of the outcome to the scissors or to each of the two blades and to the man who handled them. To manufacture a car, one needs various machines and tools, various raw materials, the labor of various manual workers, and, first of all, the plan of a designer. But nobody can decide what quota of the finished car is to be physically ascribed to each of the various factors that cooperation of which was required for the production of the car. For the sake of argument, we may for a moment set aside all the considerations which show the fallacies of the popular treatment of the problem and ask, which of the two factors, labor or capital, caused the increase in productivity? But precisely if we put the question in this way, the answer must be capital. What renders the total output in the present-day United States higher per head of manpower employed than output in earlier ages or in economically backward countries, for instance China, is the fact that the contemporary American worker is aided by more and better tools. If capital equipment per head of the worker were not more abundant than it was 300 years ago, or than it is today in China, output per head of worker would not be higher. What is required to raise, in the absence of an increase in the number of workers employed, the total amount of America's industrial output is the investment of additional capital that can only be accumulated by new saving. It is those saving and investing to whom credit is to be given for the multiplication of the productivity of the total labor force. What raises wage rates and allots to the wage earners an ever-increasing portion out of the output, which has been enhanced by additional capital accumulation, is the fact that the rate of capital accumulation exceeds the rate of increase in population. The official doctrine passes over this fact in silence or even denies it emphatically. But the policies of the unions clearly show that their leaders are fully aware of the correctness of the theory which they publicly smear as silly bourgeois apologetics. They are eager to restrict the number of job seekers in the whole country by anti-immigration laws and in each segment of the labor market by preventing the influx of newcomers. That the increase in wage rates does not depend on the individual workers' quote-unquote productivity, but on the marginal productivity of labor, is clearly demonstrated by the fact that wage rates are moving upward, also for performances in which the quote-unquote productivity of the individual has not changed at all. There are many such jobs. A barber shaves a customer today precisely in the same manner as his predecessors used to shave people 200 years ago. A butler waits at the table of the British Prime Minister in the same way in which once butlers served Pitt and Palmerston. In agriculture, some kinds of work are still performed with the same tools in the same way in which they were performed centuries ago. Yet the wage rates earned by all such workers are today much higher than they were in the past. They are higher because they are determined by the marginal productivity of labor. The employer of a butler withholds this man from employment in a factory and must therefore pay the equivalent of the increase in output, which the additional employment of one man in a factory would bring about. It is not any merit on the part of the butler that causes this rise in his wages, but the fact that the increase in capital invested surpasses the increase in the number of hands. All pseudo-economic doctrines which depreciate the role of saving in capital accumulation are absurd. What constitutes the greater wealth of a capitalistic society, as against the smaller wealth of a non-capitalistic society, is the fact that the available supply of capital goods is greater in the former than in the latter. What has improved the wage earner's standard of living is the fact that that capital equipment per head of the men eager to earn wages has increased. It is a consequence of this fact that an ever-increasing portion of the total amount of usable goods produced goes to the wage earners. None of the passionate tirades of Marx, Keynes, and a host of less well-known authors could show a weak point in the statement that there is only one means to raise wage rates permanently and for the benefit of all those eager to earn wages, namely, to accelerate the increase in capital available as against population. If this be quote-unquote unjust, then the blame rests with nature and not with man. Part 4. The quote-unquote bourgeois prejudice for liberty. The history of Western civilization is the record of a ceaseless struggle for liberty. Social cooperation under the division of labor is the ultimate and sole source of man's success in his struggle for survival and his endeavors to improve as much as possible the material conditions of his well-being. But as human nature is, society cannot exist if there is no provision for preventing unruly people from actions incompatible with community life. In order to preserve peaceful cooperation, one must be ready to resort to violent suppression of those disturbing the peace. Society cannot do without a social apparatus of coercion and compulsion, i.e., without state and government. Then a further problem emerges: to restrain the men who are in charge of the governmental functions, lest they abuse their power and convert all other people into virtual slaves. The aim of all struggles for liberty is to keep in bounds the armed defenders of peace, the governors and their constables. The political concept of the individual's freedom means freedom from arbitrary action on the part of the police power. The idea of liberty is and always has been peculiar to the West. What separates East and West is, first of all, the fact that the peoples of the East never conceived the idea of liberty. The imperishable glory of the ancient Greeks was that they were the first to grasp the meaning and significance of institutions warranting liberty. Recent historical research has traced back the origin of some of the scientific achievements previously credited to the Hellenes to Oriental sources. But nobody has ever contested that the idea of liberty originated in the cities of ancient Greece. The writings of Greek philosophers and historians transmitted it to the Romans and later to modern Europe and America. It became the essential concern of all Western plans for the establishment of the good society. It begot the laissez-faire philosophy, to which mankind owes all the unprecedented achievements of the age of capitalism. The purpose of all modern political and judicial institutions is to safeguard the individual's freedom against encroachments on the part of the government. Representative government and the rule of law, the independence of courts and tribunals from interference on the part of administrative agencies, habeas corpus, judicial examination and redress of acts of the administration, freedom of speech in the press, separation of state and church, and many other institutions aimed at one end only, to restrain the discretion of the office holders and to render the individuals free from their arbitrariness. The age of capitalism has abolished all vestiges of slavery and serfdom. It has put an end to cruel punishments and has reduced the penalty for crimes committed to the minimum indispensable for discouraging offenders. It has done away with torture and other objectionable methods of dealing with suspects and lawbreakers. It has repealed all privileges and promulgated equality of all men under the law. It has transformed the subjects of tyranny into free citizens. The material improvements were the fruit of these reforms and innovations in the conduct of government affairs. As all privileges disappeared, and everybody was granted the right to challenge the vested interests of all other people, a free hand was given to those who had the ingenuity to develop all the new industries which today render the material conditions of people more satisfactory. Population figures multiplied, and yet the increased population could enjoy a better life than their ancestors. Also, in the countries of Western civilization, there have always been advocates of tyranny. The absolute arbitrary rule of an autocrat or of an aristocracy on the one hand, and the subjugation of all other people on the other hand. But in the age of enlightenment, these voices became thinner and thinner. The cause of liberty prevailed. In the first part of the 19th century, the victorious advance of the principle of freedom seemed to be irresistible. The most eminent philosophers and historians got the conviction that historical evolution tends toward the establishment of institutions warranting freedom, and that no intrigues and machinations on the part of the champions of servilism could stop the trend toward liberalism. In dealing with the liberal social philosophy, there is a disposition to overlook the power of an important factor that worked in favor of the idea of liberty, vis-a-vis the eminent role assigned to the literature of ancient Greece in the education of the elite. There were among the great authors also champions of government omnipotence, such as Plato. But the essential tenor of Greek ideology was the pursuit of liberty. Judged by the standards of modern institutions, the Greek city-states must be called oligarchies. The liberty which the Greek statesmen, philosophers, and historians glorified as the most precious good of man was a privilege reserved to a minority. In denying it to metics and slaves, they virtually advocated the despotic rule of a hereditary caste of oligarchs. Yet, it would be a grave error to dismiss their hymns to liberty as mendacious. They were no less sincere in their praise and quest of freedom than were, 2,000 years later, the slaveholders among the signers of the American Declaration of Independence. It was the political literature of the ancient Greeks that begot the ideas of the monarchomacs, the philosophy of the Whigs, the doctrines of Althusius, Grotius, and John Locke, and the ideology of the fathers of modern constitutions and bills of rights. It was the classical studies, the essential feature of a liberal education, that kept awake the spirit of freedom in the England of the Stuarts and the France of the Bourbons, and in Italy subject to the despotism of a galaxy of princes. No less a man than Bismarck, among the 19th century statesmen next to Metternich, the foremost foe of liberty, bears witness to the fact that, even in the Prussia of Frederick William III, the gymnasium, the education based on Greek and Roman literature, was a stronghold of republicanism. The passionate endeavors to eliminate the classical studies from the curriculum of the liberal education and thus virtually to destroy its very character were one of the major manifestations of the revival of the servile ideology. It is a fact that 100 years ago, only a few people anticipated the overpowering momentum which the anti-libertarian ideas were destined to acquire in a very short time. The ideal of liberty seemed to be so firmly rooted that everybody thought that no reactionary movement could ever succeed in eradicating it. It is true, it would have been a hopeless venture to attack freedom openly and to advocate unfeignedly a return to subjection and bondage. But anti-liberalism got hold of people's minds, camouflaged as superliberalism, as the fulfillment and consummation of the very ideas of freedom and liberty. It came disguised as socialism, communism, planning. No intelligent man could fail to recognize that what the socialists, communists, and planners were aiming at was the most radical abolition of the individual's freedom and the establishment of government omnipotence. Yet the immense majority of the social intellectuals were convinced that in fighting for socialism, they were fighting for freedom. They called themselves left-wingers and Democrats, and nowadays they are even claiming for themselves the epithet, quote-unquote, liberal. We have already dealt with the psychological factors that dim the judgment of these intellectuals and the masses who followed their lead. They were, in their subconsciousness, fully aware of the fact that their failure to attain the far-flung goals which their ambition impelled them to aim at was due to deficiencies of their own. They knew very well that they were either not bright enough or not industrious enough. But they were eager not to avow their inferiority both to themselves and to their fellow men, and to search for a scapegoat. They consoled themselves and tried to convince other people that the cause of their failure was not their own inferiority, but the injustice of society's economic organization. Under capitalism, they declared, self-realization is only possible for the few. Quote, liberty in a laissez-faire society is attainable only by those who have the wealth or opportunity to purchase it, end quote. Hence, they concluded, the state must interfere in order to realize, quote-unquote, social justice. What they really meant was, in order to give to the frustrated mediocrity, according, quote-unquote, according to his needs. As long as the problems of socialism were merely a matter of debates, people who lack clear judgment and understanding could fall prey to the illusion that freedom could be preserved under a socialist regime. Such self-deceit can no longer be nurtured since the Soviet experience has shown to everybody what conditions are in a socialist commonwealth. Today, the apologists of socialism are forced to distort facts and to misrepresent the manifest meaning of words when they want to make people believe in the compatibility of socialism and freedom. The late Professor Lasky, in his lifetime an eminent member and chairman of the British Labour Party, a self-styled non-communist or even anti-communist, told us that, quote, no doubt in Soviet Russia, a communist has a full sense of liberty. No doubt also, he has a keen sense that liberty is denied him in a fascist Italy, end quote. The truth is that a Russian is free to obey all the orders issued by his superiors. But as soon as he deviates 1/100th of an inch from the correct way of thinking as laid down by the authorities, he is mercilessly liquidated. All those politicians, office holders, authors, musicians, and scientists who were, quote-unquote, purged were, to be sure, not anti-communists. They were, on the contrary, fanatical communists, party members in good standing, whom the supreme authorities, in due recognition of their loyalty to the Soviet creed, had promoted to high positions. The only offense they had committed was that they were not quick enough in adjusting their ideas, policies, books, or compositions to the latest changes in the ideas and tastes of Stalin. It is difficult to believe that these people had, quote-unquote, a full sense of liberty, if one does not attach to the word liberty a sense which is precisely the contrary of the sense which all people always used to attach to it. Fascist Italy was certainly a country in which there was no liberty. It had adopted the notorious Soviet pattern of the quote-unquote one-party principle, and accordingly suppressed all dissenting views. Yet there was still a conspicuous difference between the Bolshevik and the fascist application of this principle. For instance, there lived in fascist Italy a former member of the parliamentary group of communist deputies who remained loyal unto death to his communist tenets, Professor Antonio Graziati. He received the government pension which he was entitled to claim as Professor Emeritus, and he was free to write and to publish, with the most eminent Italian publishing firms, books which were orthodox Marxian. His lack of liberty was certainly less rigid than that of the Russian communists who, as Professor Lasky chose to say, quote-unquote, no doubt, have, quote-unquote, a full sense of liberty. Professor Lasky took pleasure in repeating the truism that liberty in practice always means liberty within law. He goes on saying that the law always aims at, quote, the conference of security upon a way of life which is deemed satisfactory by those who dominate the machinery of state, end quote. This is a correct description of the laws of a free country if it means that the law aims at protecting society against conspiracies intent upon kindling civil war and upon overthrowing the government by violence. But it is a serious misstatement when Professor Lasky adds that in a capitalistic society, quote, an effort on the part of the poor to alter in a radical way the property rights of the rich at once throws the whole scheme of liberties into jeopardy, end quote. Take the case of the great idol of Professor Lasky and all his friends, Karl Marx. When in 1848 and 1849 he took an active part in the organization and the conduct of the revolution, first in Prussia and later also in other German states, he was, being legally an alien, expelled and moved with his wife, his children, and his maid, first to Paris and then to London. Later, when peace returned and the abettors of the abortive revolution were amnestied, he was free to return to all parts of Germany and often made use of this opportunity. He was no longer in exile, and he chose of his own accord to make his home in London. Nobody molested him when he founded in 1864 the International Working Men's Association, a body whose avowed sole purpose was to prepare the great world revolution. He was not stopped when, on behalf of this association, he visited various continental countries. He was free to write and to publish books and articles which, to use the words of Professor Lasky, were certainly an effort, quote, to alter in a radical way the property rights of the rich, end quote. And he died quietly in his London home, 41 Madeline Park Road, on March 14, 1883. Or take the case of the British Labour Party. Their effort, quote, to alter in a radical way the property rights of the rich, end quote, was, as Professor Lasky knew very well, not hindered by any action incompatible with the principle of liberty. Marx, the dissenter, could live, write, and advocate revolution at ease in Victorian England, just as the Labour Party could engage in all political activities at ease in post-Victorian England. In Soviet Russia, not the slightest opposition is tolerated. This is the difference between liberty and slavery. Part 5. Liberty and Western Civilization. The critics of the legal and constitutional concept of liberty and the institutions devised for its practical realization are right in their assertion that freedom from arbitrary action on the part of the office holders is in itself not yet sufficient to make an individual free. But in emphasizing this indisputable truth, they are running against open doors. For no advocate of liberty ever contended that to restrain the arbitrariness of officialdom is all that is needed to make the citizens free. What gives to the individuals as much freedom as is compatible with life in society is the operation of the market economy. The constitutions and bills of rights do not create freedom. They merely protect the freedom that the competitive economic system grants to the individuals against encroachments on the part of the police power. In the market economy, people have the opportunity to strive after the station they want to attain in the structure of the social division of labor. They are free to choose the vocation in which they plan to serve their fellow men. In a planned economy, they lack this right. Here the authorities determine each man's occupation. The discretion of the superiors promotes a man to a better position or denies him such promotion. The individual depends entirely on the good graces of those in power. But under capitalism, everybody is free to challenge the vested interests of everybody else. If he thinks that he has the ability to supply the public better or more cheaply than other people do, he may try to demonstrate his efficiency. Lack of funds cannot frustrate his projects, for the capitalists are always in search of men who can utilize their funds in the most profitable way. The outcome of a man's business activities depends alone on the conduct of the consumers who buy what they like best. Neither does the wage earner depend on the employer's arbitrariness. An entrepreneur who fails to hire those workers who are best fitted for the job concerned and to pay them enough to prevent them from taking another job is penalized by a reduction of net revenue. The employer does not grant to employees a favor. He hires them as an indispensable means for the success of his business in the same way in which he buys raw materials and factory equipment. The worker is free to find the employment which suits him best. The process of social selection that determines each individual's position and income is continuously going on in the market economy. Great fortunes are shrinking and finally melting away completely, while other people, born in poverty, ascend to eminent positions and considerable incomes. Where there are no privileges and where governments do not grant protection to vested interests threatened by the superior efficiency of newcomers, those who have acquired wealth in the past are forced to acquire it every day anew in competition with all other people. Within the framework of social cooperation, under the division of labor, everybody depends on the recognition of his services on the part of the buying public of which he himself is a member. Everybody in buying or abstaining from buying is a member of the Supreme Court, which assigns to all people, and thereby also to himself, a definite place in society. Everybody is instrumental in the process that assigns to some people a higher and to others a smaller income. Everybody is free to make a contribution which his fellow men are prepared to reward by the allocation of a higher income. Freedom under capitalism means not to depend more on other people's discretion than these others depend on one's own. No other freedom is conceivable where production is performed under division of labor and there is no perfect economic autarky of everybody. There is no need to stress the point that the essential argument advanced in favor of capitalism and against socialism is not the fact that socialism must necessarily abolish all vestiges of freedom and convert all people into slaves of those in power. Socialism is unrealizable as an economic system because a socialist society would not have any possibility of resorting to economic calculation. This is why it cannot be considered a system of society's economic organization. It is a means to disintegrate social cooperation and to bring about poverty and chaos. In dealing with the liberty issue, one does not refer to the essential economic problem of the antagonism between capitalism and socialism. One rather points out that Western man, as different from the Asiatics, is entirely a being adjusted to life and freedom and formed by life and freedom. The civilizations of China, Japan, India, and the Mohammedan countries of the Near East, as they existed before these nations became acquainted with Western ways of life, certainly cannot be dismissed as barbarism. These peoples, already many hundreds, even thousands of years ago, brought about marvelous achievements in the industrial arts, in architecture, in literature and philosophy, and in the development of educational institutions. They founded and organized powerful empires. But then their effort was arrested. Their cultures became numb and torpid, and they lost the ability to cope successfully with economic problems. Their intellectual and artistic genius withered away. Their artists and authors bluntly copied traditional patterns. Their theologians, philosophers, and lawyers indulged in unvarying exegesis of old works. The monuments erected by their ancestors crumbled. Their empires disintegrated. Their citizens lost vigor and energy and became apathetic in the face of progressing decay and impoverishment. The ancient works of Oriental philosophy and poetry can compare with the most valuable works of the West. But for many centuries, the East has not generated any book of importance. The intellectual literary history of modern ages hardly records any name of an Oriental author. The East has no longer contributed anything to the intellectual effort of mankind. The problems and controversies that agitated the West remained unknown to the East. In Europe, there was commotion in the East. In Europe, there was commotion. In the East, there was stagnation, indolence, and indifference. The reason is obvious. The East lacked the primordial thing, the idea of freedom from the state. The East never raised the banner of freedom. It never tried to stress the rights of the individual against the power of the rulers. It never called into question the arbitrariness of the despots, and, consequently, it never established the legal framework that would protect the private citizen's wealth against confiscation on the part of the tyrants. On the contrary, deluded by the idea that the wealth of the rich is the cause of the poverty of the poor, all people approved of the practice of the governors of expropriating successful businessmen. Thus, big-scale capital accumulation was prevented, and the nations had to miss all those improvements that require considerable investment of capital. No quote-unquote bourgeoisie could develop, and consequently there was no public to encourage and to patronize authors, artists, and inventors. To the sons of the people, all roads toward personal distinction were closed but one. They could try to make their way in serving the princes. Western society was a community of individuals who could compete for the highest prizes. Eastern society was an agglomeration of subjects entirely dependent on the good graces of the sovereigns. The alert youth of the West looks upon the world as a field of action in which he can win fame, eminence, honors, and wealth. Nothing appears too difficult for his ambition. The meek progeny of Eastern parents know of nothing else than to follow the routine of their environment. The noble self-reliance of Western man found triumphant expression in such dithyrambs as Sophocles' Chloric, Antigone hymn upon man in his enterprising effort, and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Nothing of the kind has been ever heard in the Orient. It is possible that the scions of the builders of the white man's civilization should renounce their freedom and voluntarily surrender to the suzerainty of omnipotent government, that they should seek contentment in a system in which their only task will be to serve as cogs in a vast machine designed and operated by an almighty plan maker. Should the mentality of the arrested civilizations sweep the ideals Should the mentality of the arrested civilizations sweep the ideals for the ascendancy of which thousands and thousands have sacrificed their lives? Ruere in servitium, they plunged into slavery, Tacitus sadly observed in speaking of the Romans of the age of Tiberius. That concludes tonight's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So, as I've said throughout the course of this series, I'm really doing this series to get your input on what it is you want me to read next. So please, in the comments section, let me know what it is you'd like for me to read next after we conclude this interim series. So, what you might have noticed is that I'm back to wearing new clothes, and that's because this was a ridiculously long read. I had to break it up into several sections, and at this point I had to come back a few days later to wrap up the analysis and review, which, because this is going to be this was such a ridiculously long read, I'm going to try to make this review as quick as possible. No guarantees on how long it's going to be, but this has been my main probably the main criticism I've had of not only this book, and especially this chapter, but Mises in general. And that is that this is a 20-page chapter, which took me, it's going to wind up being either an hour or more than an hour, either very close to an hour or more than an hour. It's written in extremely difficult language. And even I struggled with some of this read in terms of its language, in terms of the words, that I honestly had to go, when I was doing my pre-read, I had to go over to my dictionary and for probably about a dozen or so words, I'd open up the dictionaries and say, what does this word mean? How do I even pronounce this word? And of course, there was invariably some Latin and French that I had some trouble with. This has been my main critique of Mises and his writing style. Thomas Sowell could have, instead of this being a 1 hour long, 20-page chapter with incredibly difficult language, Thomas Sowell would have had this done in 5 pages, and it would have been about a 15-minute read, because there's really not much to extrapolate from this chapter. It just happens to have been written in the language of Mises, which is unbelievably difficult. And again, if it takes me longer than that 15 minutes to recap the chapter, it's because I'm not Thomas Sowell. Excuse me. But this is part of why I love Thomas Sowell, is that he winds up writing for the common reader. He writes his books in a way that it's very easy to understand, very easy to read, and he gets through it with concision. And as you guys know, if you guys have been following my Mike Reads reviews, which I'll put a link to that series in this video's description, I suppose, concision is something I really like in everything. And in this case, we're getting the exact opposite out of Mises from that. And again, we're not getting common parlance at all out of Mises. So that, if there's a criticism that I'm fully on board with Mises, it's that, and this chapter is utterly perfectly emblematic of that complaint. So without further ado, let's just get on quickly. And so because of how unbelievably long this chapter is and how difficult it is, we're not going to be focusing on the esoteric and specific points that he makes, but on the we'll call it 5, really. We're just going to be touching on the main points. And the first one we'll do real quick is just a very minor point about art, because he spends so much time in this chapter and in this book talking about it. Art. The TLDR, the too long didn't read, for the entire points about art is that the reason we don't get these gigantic, ornate monoliths to just ostentatious excess, though beautiful, is because we don't have despots who can force people to erect the colossi of times past, right? The reason we don't have these things is because when you are a king, you can direct people to do things that they otherwise obviously wouldn't do if they have the freedom to do that. And the lesson that's really revealed from all of this is that it's as Thomas Sowell would say, it's the mundane things in life that make things in life less miserable. So building the pyramids for the people who are building the pyramids, what degree of misery did that take away from their lives? Especially knowing that it took, in the case of the pyramids, in some cases, generations to actually build these pyramids. In the Great Pyramid of Giza, it took decades to build this project. And there are some people who for the entirety of their lifetime, this project was under construction, and that's all they knew. That's all they did. But in the end, how miserable was their life at the beginning? How miserable was their life at the end? And the truth is that it's not all of these ostentatious, though beautiful, monoliths that reduce the level of misery in everyday life, it's really mundane things. It's things like having a pillow to sleep on rather than your arms or a pile of pine cones. Having things like an actual asphalt shingle roof over your head that actually washes away water without just falling apart in the most mild of storms. Having something like that, which isn't something you really think much about, right? The clothes I'm wearing, the fact that I can just go to a store and get comfortable clothing that serves a clear and particular end. I mean, these are things that we just take for granted today. You don't even realize that you're wearing the clothes that you're wearing in most cases. This is kind of a little bit of a lesson in psychology. These are one of these things that your brain just, when it comes to perception, although we can sense that there is clothing on us, our brain kind of weeds these things out. Because, and that speaks to just how mundane these things are in our life and how for granted we just take these things. It's not that people don't care about art, but that art does very little to affect the things that really make life miserable. If I hang a painting on the wall, it may be a beautiful painting, but whatever time, energy, money, whatever I did to exchange for that painting, I could have done to say, fix a window. And fixing that window may mean that the draft that's coming in when it's 20 degrees out, instead of having that giant hole in my window where this draft is pouring in right over our bed or right over our cooking space, I could have that window patched up. Which kind of speaks towards Bastiat's broken window fallacy, which we went over. Let's see if I can pull the book out real quick, which we went over in our series. We beat to death in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, which was that lesson, which is the broken window fallacy for all intents and purposes, extrapolated to other concepts. Something like a sewer treatment plant or a water treatment plant is basically the thing that is now replacing the Great Library, that's replacing the Acropolis. All of these beautiful monoliths that cost a fortune, you wind up getting sewer treatment plants. You get water treatment plants. Things that make it so that you can be sure that your poop will go away and that you won't be just wallowing in your own feces. And that when it comes to water treatment plants, are going to guarantee that you have clean and potable water. And when you're free to make these decisions, these are the things you care more about. You would much rather have clean, potable water than an Acropolis, as beautiful as Acropolis is. And on top of that, if you're going to build the sewer or water treatment plant, you're not going to erect it with ornate gargoyles. You're not going to have these gargoyle statues at the corners of the ceilings of these buildings. You're just going to have generic rectangular gutters and downspouts. And the reason that's the case is because that money, that capital, that time, that energy, even in the private sector, could be spent on other things, which again would make life less miserable. Like speaking right back to the broken window fallacy, that instead of spending the money on the gargoyles, which would make the building itself look more beautiful, you end up spending it on things like, say, an underwater camera that allows you to better see what's going on underneath at the bottom of this pool of human waste, human excrement, that would allow you to better see if there's going to be a jam in the line at some point and allow you to better monitor what's going on under there so you can do a better job of getting rid of all of that human waste, human excrement. The reason we don't have these ancient monoliths, these ancient, highly ornate artistic entries into our history, the reason we don't have these things is because we were free to spend our time, energy, and money on all the other things that now afford us massive luxury by comparison. And we're going to come back to that thought in a minute in the third main point here. But the second main point here is basically just Smith's lesson. And the revelation that Smith's lesson becomes twofold. Excuse me, I'll get the book off the shelf because I'm about to get some quotes out of here. So there's basically two parts to Smith's lesson that is effectively revealed. We don't talk much, I haven't talked much on this channel about the second half of this, but there's Smith's lesson, which we've beaten to death. When you exchange a candy bar for $2, and I give to the clerk at the gas station $2 for the candy bar, and he gives me the candy bar, the clerk views the $2 as being worth more than the candy bar, and I view the candy bar as being worth more than $2. And this is self-evident by the fact that the exchange happens. If it wasn't the case, the exchange wouldn't happen. In mutually consensual transactions, it is axiomatically and self-evidently true that everybody wins by virtue of it being mutually consensual. On that alone. So there's that first obvious lesson. But there's kind of a subtler second lesson to be extrapolated from that. And that lesson is that the natural state is awful. It's just endless human misery, right? The natural state is plant yourself on a desert island. Plant yourself on, actually, in fact, let's not make it a desert island. Let's make it a tropical paradise. Plant yourself naked on this tropical paradise. In fact, plant you and a dozen or so other people naked on this tropical paradise. And without the civilization, without the pre-existing culture, without the pre-existing capital that was built up over the course of centuries, if not millennia, the life of those 12 people is going to be complete and utter misery until they do the things that allow them to not be completely and utterly miserable. Everything a man does when it comes to economic transactions is an attempt to wash away a portion of the suffering from the natural state. It's not there to necessarily add luxury. It's there to subtract suffering, in this case, and to subtract misery. And of course, this kind of speaks towards, and you can extrapolate this from Smith's lesson, I suppose, this kind of speaks towards the subjective theory of value, that what brings you misery is not the same thing that necessarily brings everyone else misery, right? If you were gonna, if we could take this to its logical end and talk about Joker and talk about masochism, but the point is that when Mises talks about televisions, the television set may bring someone else less misery in their life, but for me, the television set doesn't really do a whole lot. But the point is, but like I said, everything a man does is to wash away a portion of that suffering and not to add upon that luxury. And that again speaks to the subjective theory of value. On page 44, quote, "A man who buys a television set thereby gives evidence to the effect that he thinks the possession of this contrivance will increase his well-being and make him more content than he was without it," end quote. And this, of course, again, speaks to the subjective theory of value, which destroys the entirety of the basis upon which Marx's economic theory was based. But I really want to have people understand the second half of that. Like, I really want to focus in on that last part. Quote, "more content than he was without it." As in, the thing itself isn't necessarily bringing him to a specific state of luxury or to necessarily bring him out of the overall state of misery, but to make him more content than he was without it. As in, it's just simply a generic improvement on the station of his life, subjectively, of course, because value is subjective, which we know because who knows how much misery that television set is actually bringing away from him, and there's really no great way to measure that. The third main lesson is the lesson that we just extrapolated, and that is that the natural state is misery. The amenities of modernity exist because nature is cruel, and humans have a built-in desire to avoid the proverbial slings and arrows of the quote-unquote natural human existence. They have a built-in desire to improve your own station. This is endemic to the human condition. And again, we can see this on that tropical island scenario where you have 12 people on that island. Well, if one of them, we could say that all 12 of them start off by just kind of perusing the shallows for snails and mussels and whatever clams and hermit crabs they can get their hands on and just eat raw, right? But at some point, somebody's going to say, you know what? We can get the fish that are out off into the ocean. We can't safely swim out and just catch them because they're fish. And, the breaking of the waves against the shore is kind of dangerous for us. So we need a way to hurl a bait and hook over those breakers and about 30 or 40 feet into the sea to actually get access to those fish, which means you need to fashion yourself, a rod, a reel, a string line, a hook, bait, all of these things. And that takes an enormous amount of time. But if you have enough people on that island and you give them enough time, obviously this is what's going to happen. Nobody contests this. Obviously somebody's going to have this idea to do those sort of things. The sub-lesson, of course, is that from all of this is that when it comes to those fishing reels and those fishing rods, these machines and the machines that are in the factories, of course, don't just materialize out of thin air. This is the lesson of pages 49 to 51. Somebody with a ton of saved up capital had to make them, or use that saved up capital to pay someone else to make them. And if they didn't save up that capital, in the case of the latter, in both cases they wouldn't exist, but in the case of the latter, if they don't save up that money, that capital, to pay someone else to make the fishing rod and reel, then the rod and reel would never get built, because the person making the rod and reel isn't just making them for the hell of it. Again, the person making that rod and reel has to first be employed to make that rod and reel to have any incentive to do so if he's serving someone else. If I'm paying somebody else to do that thing, the only reason that thing happens is because I've paid him to do the thing. Otherwise, he would just do it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to pay him to do it. Otherwise, I could just grab the thing from him. Otherwise, he would just make it. If he's a perfectly altruistic person, there has to be something there that allows that person to make it. If I'm the one making it, again, purely out of altruism, I have to have in my mind the capacity to make that. I have to have the years of practice making those sort of things. I have to have the ingenuity that goes along with making those things. I have to have, of course, the physical resources and, importantly, in that tropical island scenario, the time to do those things. It's going to take me days and days and days to fashion that fishing rod, reel, string, hook, and bait. It's going to take me days to do that. This isn't something I can sling together in 10 minutes, which means that since it's going to take me days to do that, I have to set aside portions of my day where I'm either sleeping or, out in the shallows trying to, gather as many mussels, clams, snails, and hermit crabs as I possibly can and just gorging myself on whatever I can catch. I'm going to lose some weight. Which means that's my savings. And the lesson to be extrapolated from all of this, of course, is that let's go back from this. The fact that said capital, all of these things that we talked about, which doesn't have to be money, by the way. It can be just time and energy. It could be just, again, that person's starving on the island for a few days while he fashions himself a rod and reel to catch the big fish, right? The fact that said capital is solely owned by that individual is the defining characteristic of capitalism. And the only thing that allows me to save that time and energy. If that time and energy belongs to someone else, or there's no protection of the savings of that time and energy, if someone else is just going to say, why isn't he gathering up those clams? What is he doing with that, what is he doing with that stick that he's fashioning right now? What is he doing with that clam shell, or the shell that he's using as a hook? Let's say, why is he collecting bait rather than eating these things? If the 11 of us just go out there and beat this guy into doing his part, then this guy is never going to save up that time and energy. Again, you don't have to have money. If there's no surety of protection of savings, why would you bother saving? You may as well just, in the case of paper currency, light that saving on fire. If you don't have a guarantee of the surety of the protection of that savings, then you wouldn't save it, because it would be literally just as effective as setting it on fire. And again, we've talked about how this doesn't have to be currency. And the other lesson to come from all of this is that saving is the only way to build wealth. We talked about that desert island scenario. Maybe it's shelter that you're looking to build. Maybe by getting 8 hours of great sleep rather than needing 12 hours of awful sleep, I now have more energy to be doing throughout the course of the day the things I need to do, and thus I become a better clam collector, a better mussel collector. Maybe I then have, if I only need 8 hours of sleep to get through my day rather than the 12 hours of awful sleep I'm getting just on the bare sand, right? If I fashion myself a proper shelter, maybe I need less sleep, and then I have time to do other things. But building that shelter is going to take a ton of time and energy. And I'm going to have to set aside time from the rest of the day that I was doing other things in order to fashion that shelter and to fashion that fishing pole. In the meantime, the opposite of that, of course, is if you're not only not saving, but if you're actually burning through capital, you're doing the exact opposite too. So once I get that shelter, once I get that fishing pole, if I just simply fashion a fishing pole and then sell it and then use that to buy someone else's, if I just use that to then sell it, let's say for food, then everything I've gained long-term, the potential for me to have all of those fish is just poof, gone. And we'll come into a better example than the fishing pole in just a minute. But this is the point that is made on pages 50 to 51. If all the products are consumed without replacement of the capital goods, which have been used up in their production, capital is consumed. So we're burning through capital. If this happens, further production will be aided only by a smaller amount of capital goods and will therefore render a smaller output per unit of the natural resources and labor employed. To prevent this sort of dissaving and disinvestment, one must dedicate a part of the productive effort to capital maintenance or to the replacement of capital goods absorbed in the production of usable goods, which means in order for it to be worthwhile to have the thing, even after I've caught all of those fish, I have to spend resources either saving up those fish so I can have another pole after this one breaks, or continuously be working on this pole. So not only do I have to have that excess, I have to have an excess on top of that, right? And yeah, maybe we have introduced specialization on my island where I'm the only one that does all the fishing because I can catch so many fish with my rod and reel, and fish are way more nutritious than whatever, mussels, snails, clams, etc. we can get by wading through the shallows. If I don't do that sort of maintenance, if I just burn through the rod and reel, if in the case of a landscaping company, I sell one of my landscaping trucks to pay off the labor, to pay the wages, salaries, tips, etc., to pay my employees for a certain period of time, then I've lost the material gain that is that truck. So if we destroy the thing that allows for that savings to take place, that allows for that excess to take place, eventually I'm not going to be able to employ these guys, because how do I continue to do the work? How do I continue to pay these guys if I'm dependent upon selling capital to actually pay these guys? I can't. And then I lose out on the short and long-term productivity, which is the point that he was making on pages 50 and 51. The main point, though, from this part of the lesson is on page 51, quote, "Capital is not a free gift of God or of nature. It is the outcome of a provident restriction of consumption on the part of man," end quote. Again, it doesn't just come from the ether. Capital doesn't just come from the ether. All of this savings isn't what we have today in terms of luxuries doesn't just pre-exist. It doesn't just come from nothing. It comes from these ages and ages and ages of savings, which is something Marxists and communists get, of course, horribly wrong, and they adopted the position that the pre-existing conditions of luxury are actually a default state rather than the result of a conscious decision. The fourth lesson, and this is going to be a bit of a repudiation more directly of socialism and communism, is that socialism's quote-unquote success is in the face, quote-unquote success in the face of liberty, is as a wolf in sheep's clothing. And this is the lesson of pages 56 to 57, which I'll be quoting at great length in just a moment. This is something I've actually been talking about for a long time, that so much of Marxist, socialist, communist ideology is so facially antithetical to what is easily observed every day that you have to completely reinvent language not just English, but language and the concept of language at such a fundamental level to mean things it never meant, to make the ideas in any way palatable to the West, which means that all of these ideas that Marx was espousing in the middle 19th century were kind of destroyed and dismantled by the end of the 19th century and became completely unpalatable. For example, the left's complete, and it speaks towards this, the left's complete rejection of logic. Not that they don't adhere to a certain logic, it's just that they openly reject logic at this point. And I'll have to save that for another video, which is going to take me some time to get through. And I'm actually going through that debate right now on another channel. well, somebody who's actually proving my point, that what's become the distinction between the left and right is kind of speaking towards this rejection of logic in general, which stems from a Marxist vision of nihilism. The rise of the USSR in World War II, the rise of USSR and World War II meant early 20th century communists in the US, who actually had a full-on communist presidential candidate in the early 1920s, had to go into hiding. And they then had to penetrate the general culture surreptitiously. And Mises makes this point. Remember, this book was written in 1956. So remember that as we read this. Does this sound familiar? Mises is basically making Yuri Bezmenov's point on pages 56 through 57. That you had to kind of subvert the existing language in order to make these ideas palatable to anyone who's in any way subscribed to anything that originated from the West. So starting on page 56, quote, "It is true, it would have been a hopeless venture to attack freedom openly and to advocate unfeignedly a return to subjection and bondage. But anti-liberalism got hold of people's minds camouflaged as superliberalism, as the fulfillment and consummation of the very ideas of freedom and liberty. It was disguised as socialism, communism, planning," end quote. So there he's saying that socialism, communism, planning tried to hide itself as some sort of superliberalism, as some sort of super libertarian take, which is how you get some people on the left who consider themselves libertarian socialists, which anyone who's actually read anything on any of those things knows that that's an oxymoron, that it is a thing which is then being modified by its antonym. Once again, we'll have to get into another video at some point that it speaks to Marx's dialectic, that a thing can necessarily be simultaneously itself and its antonym. You have to destroy language for that to be true. Not just English. You have to destroy the concept of language in order for that to be true. The fact that language itself has limitations, has rules. The fact that a thing is necessarily a thing, right? And that if it's necessarily a thing, it can't also simultaneously be its antonym. These are one of the axioms that you have to accept within the framework of any language, never mind English. Mises continues on page 57, quote, "No intelligent man could fail to recognize that what the socialists, communists, and planners were aiming at was the most radical abolition of the individual's freedom and the establishment of government omnipotence." So what he's saying there is that it became obvious that what they were saying was, what they were advocating for was a destruction of freedom, was a destruction of individualism. And it became obvious. Yet the immense majority of the socialist intellectuals were convinced that in fighting for socialism, they were fighting for freedom. So why was that? They called themselves left-winged and Democrats, and nowadays they are even claiming for themselves the epithet liberal, end quote. He continues on page 57, quote, "Liberty in a laissez-faire society is attainable only by those who have the wealth or opportunity to purchase it. Hence, they concluded, the socialists, the state must interfere in order to realize, quote-unquote, social justice." Again, file this under the endless list of this book's "Does this sound familiar?" Continuing on page 57, quote, "Such self-deceit can no longer be nurtured since the Soviet experience has shown to everybody what conditions are in the socialist commonwealth. Today, the apologists of socialism are forced to distort facts and to misrepresent the manifest meaning of words when they want to make people believe in the compatibility of socialism and freedom." Again, does any of this sound familiar? As anyone who's read 1984 or seen Yuri Bezmenov speak, does any of this sound familiar? When you are faced with the USSR, you have to manipulate language in order to basically deceive people into subscribing to the theories that led to the USSR, and obviously so. And what that actually brings us around to is point 5, chapter 4's main thesis, which is the idea that freedom is baked into the language of the West, originating centuries, if not millennia ago, in the halls of ancient Greece. language being so strongly and causally linked to the inner dialogue, if you will, or the inner mind, freedom is a built-in feature of the mind in the West. Once you have adopted the language of the West, it's built in that you have the framework for freedom in the libertarian or Western sense. It is not so much that the rest of the world rejects it, it's that they have no place for it. They have no place for its conception. The language of the rest of the world doesn't allow for even a framework in the mind for the concept to ever exist. Thus, it is not a part of their values, their mores, their beliefs, their moral codes. What do I mean by that? So if you have the language of the West and the languages of the rest of the world, remember that language and the mind, the inner consciousness, the inner dialogue, are so causally linked that they might as well be considered the same. This is something I'll have to say for another video, but just to be clear, in the West, you have a subset of language, a spot within language that allows for the concept of freedom. And then within that concept of freedom, you can have a positive acceptance or a negative rejection of that freedom. Right? There is a place for freedom and those who accept or reject it. In the other cultures of the world that adopt a completely different language, there's no circle for freedom. So there's no way to accept or reject it. It just, in the mind, the way it's conceived in the West, it just doesn't exist. And this is why freedom Western concept of freedom cannot persist in other cultures. This is why you get so much of the Far East completely embedded in not just communism, but just a rejection of individualism and collectivism. North Korea, where do we have collectivism in the halls of government around the world? The strongest places for collectivism are places like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, China, North Korea. You have this in the Far East. Even Japan only kind of accepts individualism. Even South Korea, individualism isn't really a part of their culture. It's only part of their government because they've seen that it actually works in the West. They've seen what kind of prosperity it actually brings to the West and what kind of clear material misery is removed from life from the West. So even within those cultural frameworks, there really isn't a great home, even today, in places like South Korea and Japan and the Philippines, and even Singapore, really. There really isn't a carve-out in their language, in their mind, in their framework of viewing the world for the Western conception of individualized freedom. Mises explains on page 62, quote, "The East lacked the primordial thing, the idea of freedom from the state. The East never raised the banner of freedom. It never tried to stress the rights of the individual against the power of its rulers. It never called into question the arbitrariness of despots," end quote. The last thing before I'll sign off here is that I will have to look into George Sorrell's conception of syndicalism. It sounds a lot like he's just offering an absolutist, consequentialist take on the world. But I'll have to look more into that at some point. So that has been chapter 4. We are going to continue in this mini-series, if you will, this interim series with chapter 5, which will close out the book. Chapter 5 is entitled, quote-unquote, Anti-Communism versus Capitalism. So until then, it's been Mike, signing off.